Well, today I will be discussing about the Okun's law. And this law, it is a law and it has a great importance in macroeconomics because you can do your research work on this topic. And during this COVID-19 situation, when there is a recession in the world, and the recession actually actually brings the unemployment. So unemployment is one of the important issue in economic development, both in the developed and developing countries. In developed countries, the unemployment is like due to the technological change, technological improvement. But in undeveloped or developing countries, the issue is different. The capital stock is less in underdeveloped countries, and as a result of that, there is unemployment in the economy. But unemployment is important in the sense that if people of a country remains unemployed, what happens? What happens? The GDP will hamper because they are the human resource. They are underutilized. If they are utilized, if they are employed, then naturally GDP will improve. So GDP is actually related to the unemployment. So here the Okun's law exists. Even today it has an important application, and there is the scope of research in on this topic. Okun's law actually focused on the cyclical unemployment. One concept, that what is the cyclical unemployment? When, suppose with an example I can clarify it. When an automobile worker is laid off during a recession to cut labor cost, during this downturn, people are being people are buying fewer vehicles. In the recessions, people are buying fewer vehicles. So the manufacturer does not need as many workers to meet the demand. High or a low cyclical employment is only temporary. So is recession there is cyclical unemployment because there is less sale of vehicles. In this situation, the COVID-19 situation, you can find this type of scenario. You can find such type of scenario. And there is a negative demand shock. There is a negative supply shocks. So number of negative shocks are there in this situation of COVID-19. So here is the importance of Okun's law. From the beginning of 2003 through the first quarter of 2006, real gross domestic product in the USA grew at an average annual rate of 3.4%. But but unemployment continued to drift downward. And this situation presented a puzzle for the policymakers and economists who expected the unemployment to increase as the economy slowed. Typically, growth slowdowns coincides with rising unemployment. This negative correlation between GDP growth and unemployment has been named Okun's law after the economist Arthur Okun, who first documented it in the early 1960s. Now, in this lecture, try to clarify the Okun's law with a practical example. Here I have used the economy of Japan. Now, the Okun's law. In Okun's law, there are the difference version, the gap version, and the dynamic version. What is the difference version? You can find this equation. What does it mean? This is the unemployment rate. Okay? This is the unemployment rate, change in unemployment. And this is the change in GDP growth rate. And this is the coefficient. You can say this is the Okun's coefficient. And this is the error part. Okay? And this alpha is the constant. If this part is not in this equation, then what remains? Remains only this part. So this part is the unemployment. Unemployment is the natural rate of unemployment, you know. So this is the difference version. So this is the difference version of the Okun's law. One would expect that the Okun's coefficient is negative. Okay? Okun's coefficient is negative. That is, there is a relationship between the unemployment rate and the GDP growth rate. There is a negative relationship. If there is an increase in the GDP, unemployment rate will fall. Okay? If there is increase in GDP, unemployment rate will fall. And here you can remember one thing, that there is a domestic economy and there is a open economy. So in the domestic economy, there is GDP. And in the open economy, there is GNP. So when there is an increase in GDP, unemployment rate will fall. 1% reduction in unemployment rate will increase the GDP 2% in the domestic economy. So by increasing the 2% GDP, you can reduce the unemployment rate to 1%. As far as the Okun's research is concerned. And when there is a GNP, 1% increase, 1% unemployment rate. Decrease in 1% unemployment rate will increase 3% increase in GDP. That is, inversely, you can say that if there is an increase in GDP, 3% increase in GDP, there is a GNP, there is a deduction, 1% reduction of unemployment rate. So this is the difference version. It is important. It is important you can understand it. And this part is the remaining factors that can have effect, on this part, Okay. Now the gap version. This is the gap version of the Okun's law. This is the unemployment. This is the unemployment. This is the coefficient of Okun's. This is constant part. And this is the gap between the actual GDP and potential GDP. Actual GDP and potential GDP. Okay. So on that basis, the difference, on the basis of this difference, if the difference unemployment depend. Unemployment, on the basis of this difference, unemployment depend. The gap version states that for every 1% increase in the unemployment rate, a country's GDP will be roughly an additional 2% lower than its potential GDP. Okay. The difference version describes the relationship between the quarterly changes in unemployment and quarterly changes in real GDP. Now, you can find the dynamic version of the GDP. Here, I have used the vector autoregression model. Look, here the unemployment rate depends on the previous period's real GDP. Current quarter's unemployment depends on the past quarter's real GDP. So this is the dynamic version. This is the dynamic version, and this dynamic version is related with the difference version. So here is the three versions of the Okun's law: the difference version, the gap version, and the dynamic version. Now, look here with an example of Japan. The economy of Japan is considered here. Look, this is the recent data up to 2020 second quarter data is here. So here you can find that this is the unemployment over the quarters. There is a fall and there is an increase in the unemployment rate. Look, where there is an increase in the unemployment rate near about 2009 first quarter or 2008 fourth quarter. There is in the 2008 first quarter there is an increase in unemployment, and it gets the top point on near about the 2008 fourth quarter. Okay, so here some problem must be there. And if you can remember that there was a recession, there was a worldwide recession, so there is an increase in the unemployment rate. Now look at the GDP. Now look at the GDP. The GDP in that time in Japan, there is a fall. There is a fall. At the same time, there is a fall. Okay. At the same time, there is an increase in unemployment rate and there is a fall in GDP. And the same way, in the 2019 fourth quarter, from fourth quarter to 2020 first quarter, second quarter, there is an increase in the unemployment, and at the same time there is a decrease in the GDP. There is a nice picture you can find from these two pictures. If you have a comparative study, then you can have a clear idea. There is the unemployment and GDP relation. And in the Japan, the fall in the GDP starts from 2018. There is you can say the Japan is an export dependent country, and the domestic consumption has an important has been playing an important role in the Japan economies. And COVID-19 situation, during this COVID-19 situation, you can find there is a negative shocks of demand in the economy of Japan, and also there is a export shocks, negative shocks due to this pandemic situation. There is a negative shock in the export on which the Japan's economy is mostly dependent. So there are two shocks, huge shocks: export shocks and domestic demand shocks. So that hampers the economy. Now, if you have the rate structure, then also you can find over the period of my study, you can find that there is a decrease in GDP growth rate, and there is increase in, at the same time, increase in unemployment rate. And when there is an increase in GDP growth rate, then there is a fall in the unemployment rate. And the same thing you can find near about in the 2020. There is a decrease in GDP and there is increase in unemployment rate. So definitely Okun's law exists in this in Japan. In Japan, we can apply the Okun's law in Japan even today. There are some finding where Okun's law actually breaks down. When there is a jobless increase in GDP, then you can find a different result. But in the economy of Japan, from my study, there is a relationship. Okay, there is a relationship you can find here. Now look, this is my findings of research that GDP growth rate actually affects the unemployment rate. This is the Ganjar causality. Vector regression Ganjar causality. On the basis of these, we can say that the GDP growth rate actually affect the unemployment rate. As we have seen in my previous slides, there is a pictorial presentation, and this is the statistically significant result. On the basis, we can say the economy of Japan supports the Okun's law. Now, this is the variance decomposition of unemployment rate in the economy of Japan. You can find in the short run that most of the fluctuation in the forecast error variance of unemployment rate is GDP growth rate has an important role near about the 41%. The fluctuation, the variation in the forecast error variance GDP growth rate is 41% responsible. We have to include ahead forecast in forecast. And this is actually the forecast error variance of unemployment rate. So if you have 20 period quarters, and you can say that in the variation of forecast error variance, in the fluctuation of the forecast error variance is actually affected by the GDP growth rate. And it is near about 40.50% GDP growth rate is responsible for the variation in the unemployment rate in the economy of Japan over my study. Okay. So we can say that here is the role of policymakers and the decision takers. What type of policy should be taken to reduce the unemployment rate? And how the economy could move forward to achieve the sustainable economic growth and to reduce unemployment. Policymakers should eliminate ambiguities about the future, keep the risks to a minimum, and boost the market through the implementation of monetary and fiscal policies. In order to support economic growth and increase employment, it is important to use fiscal policy instruments such as offering loan incentives and increasing public expenses and reducing tax rates. So here is the policy implication. So Okun's law has an important role here today. Different economics in this COVID-19 actually has been taking different type of measures to save the unemployment situation. But in the long run, you have to increase the GDP to reduce the unemployment rate, and clear and focused fiscal policy and monetary policy should be there. So I think you have a proper understanding over the Okun's law, and with a empirical research, with the empirical findings, I have tried my level best to clarify the situation on the basis of the Okun's law and considering the economy of Japan. Japan is a developed country. So thank you for enjoying this lecture, and thank you very much.